Chapter XII Moscow Great Principle in Ivan III and the ASILYA 3. 34. Education of the territory of the Russian state. Association of Northeastern Russia. Since the XIV century, there were closer economic ties between the separate Russian principalities. This contributed to the gradual unification of them into one national Russian state. The process of unification was accelerated by the need to jointly organize defense from the Tatars and other external enemies. With the son of Basil the Dark, Ivan III, 1462–1505, the Moscow Grand Duchy has annexed almost all the lands of northeastern Russia. Of the areas that until then retained their independence, the most extensive was the Novgorod land, which consisted of huge colonial possessions. Novgorod continued to be governed by the Vesh and elective possedniks and Tiziatskis. With the great princes, he concluded treaties, but the Novgorod boyars perfectly saw that their liberties are coming to an end. Among the Novgorod boyars was a group ready to be transferred to the side of Lithuania in order to preserve their former rights. At the head of this party was the rich and influential family of Borisky. One of them was a Novgorod possadnik. Her mother, the energetic Marfa Borisskaya, led the struggle with Moscow. The Borisky supporters shouted at the Vesh, "We do not want to be called the patrimony of the Grand Duke of Moscow. We are free people, we do not want to tolerate resentment from Moscow, we want for King Casimir." In 1471, the Novgorod boyars were changed to Moscow and surrendered to the power of the Grand Duke of Lithuania Casimir, who was at the same time a Polish king. On the contrary, the Novgorod Hurdle stood for a connection with Moscow. With Moscow, Novgorod was closely connected with the unity of language and culture. Ivan III marched against Novgorod with a large army. In the decisive battle on the Shilony River, the Novgorod army was defeated. Novgorod warriors from artisans, barely sitting on their horses, turned into an erratic flight. The city lacked bread, and the poorest population forced the boyars to enter into negotiations with the Grand Duke. Ivan III ceased military operations under the condition of payment of indemnity. The Novgorodians undertook to break the alliance with Lithuania. Despite the defeat, Novgorod retained its former liberties. However, the troubles continued in Novgorod. The party, defeated, began to settle accounts with Moscow's friends, and they were looking for counsels from the Grand Duke. In 1477 the Moscow party sent ambassadors to the Grand Duke to welcome him as sovereign. Such a title Novgorodians until then, the Grand Dukes have never been given. Ivan III took this opportunity to demand the same state in Novgorod as he had in Moscow, that is, unlimited power. When the Novgorod Vesh did not agree to the demands of Ivan III, he again moved against Novgorod and besieged it. This time the Novgorodians did not try to resist. In January 1478, after lengthy negotiations, they were forced to accept all the conditions of the Grand Duke. The Vesh was destroyed. Instead of the possedniks, the Grand Dukes had to be governed. A considerable part of the lands of the Novgorod feudal lords went to the Grand Duke. The Novgorod Republic ceased to exist. The symbol of Novgorod's liberty, the Vesh bell, was removed and taken away. A large number of Novgorod boyars and merchants, including Marfa Borisskaya, were relocated to Moscow cities, and Muscovites settled in their place. On land taken from the Novgorod boyars, the Grand Duke planted Moscow service people. Pskov retained some more hints of independence, because in the war with Novgorod he helped Moscow. Ivan III. With modern French engravings. Then the Tver Principality, which once rivaled Moscow, was annexed. Tver Prince Mikhail Borisovich, like Novgorod, entered into relations with Casimir, the King of Poland and the Prince of Lithuania. Ivan III took advantage of this and besieged Tver. Michael at night fled to Lithuania, his boyars went to serve to the victor, 1485. The Ryazan Principality also fell into a vassal dependence on Moscow. Thus, Under Ivan III in the northeastern Russia, in place of the former independent lands, a single national Russian state was formed. The union of Russian principalities around Moscow was already prepared by the development of market ties between individual Russian lands. It was accelerated by the fact that the danger posed by the Tatars, Lithuanians and other enemies made the entire Russian people unite for a common defense. Compared with feudal fragmentation, the creation of a single feudal state was a positive phenomenon, since such a state provided a better opportunity in this epoch for the further development of the country's productive forces. The Russian national state united the Russian nationality. The peoples of Belarus and Ukraine, related to the Russian people, could not free themselves from the power of Lithuania and Poland and form their own national states. And only afterwards they joined the Russian people in a single centralized multi-ethnic state. 35. Liberation from the Tatar yoke. The overthrow of the Tatar yoke. Having united around the rest of the princedoms of northeastern Russia, Moscow became so strong that it decided to finally overthrow the Tatar yoke. Ivan III skillfully took advantage of the fragmentation of the horde. He entered into a close alliance with the Crimean Khan Mengligiri. Ivan sent letters to the Crimea every year with presents to the Khan, his wives and the biggest feudal lords. Using the weakening of the Golden Horde, Ivan III stopped paying tribute to the Tatars. The Golden Horde Khan Akhmat entered into an alliance with the Grand Duke of Lithuania and in 1480 went on a campaign to force Moscow to pay tribute. The Grand Duke came out with an army to meet the Tatars on the Oka. But Akhmat, who was waiting for help from the Lithuanian prince, moved upstream the river, towards the Lithuanian border. Ivan III at this time was at a quarrel with his brothers, who threatened to raise the uprising. The Grand Duke left the army for a while and hurried to Moscow. However, the Muscovites, who were bellicose, began to demand an immediate return to the army. Then Ivan III reconciled with his brothers and returned. Both troops, Tatar and Russian, stood opposite each other on the opposite banks of the Ugra River, the tributary of the Oka. Neither Russians nor Tatars crossed the river. Akhmat was ready to make peace, but he demanded tribute as before. Bishop Rostov of Vassian addressed Ivan III with a message in which he urged him to stand bravely against the Tatars and not obey the cowards advised to betray the fatherland to the enemies. So the time stretched to frost. When Ugra was covered with ice, Ivan III ordered his troops to retreat in order to give battle in more favorable positions. But the Khan did not dare to go on the offensive. His army suffered from cold and lack of food. In addition, the ally of Ivan III, the Crimean Khan Mengligiri, attacked the possessions of the Golden Horde from the rear, and the Grand Duke of Lithuania, who promised to help, deceived Akhmat. Therefore, Akhmat departed from the Moscow borders. This was the end of the Tatar-Mongol yoke, which for 2 centuries gravitated over the Russian people. Having defended its independence from the Tatars, the Russian national state, uniting individual Russian principalities, gained the opportunity for further political and economic growth and consolidation. Until recently, the powerful Golden Horde was soon finally defeated by Crimean Tatars. In place of the Golden Horde in the lower reaches of the Volga, a small khanate was formed, the capital of which was the city of Astrakhan. Accession of the peoples of the north and the Volga region. Joining Russian lands and defending them from enemies, Ivan III simultaneously conquered lands inhabited by other nations. After the annexation of Novgorod, he seized Novgorod's colony. In 1472 the Moscow army entered the Perm land. It was a country inhabited by the Permian Komi. Moscow troops defeated the Prince of Perm, took the main towns and burned them. Firefight on the Ugra. Nikon's Chronicle. The Perm land was to recognize the power of the Grand Duke of Moscow. Several times, campaigns were undertaken to conquer Ugra beyond the Urals. In 1500 Moscow troops crossed the Ural Mountains. In the mountains they were attacked by the Nainats, but defeated them and repulsed 200 deer. Further, the Moscow governors rode deer, and simple warriors, on dogs. The Ugra princes who came out to meet them were defeated and undertook to pay tribute. Ivan III forced the Kazan Khanate to recognize its vassal dependence on Moscow. He interfered with the appointment of Khans to the Kazan throne, and the Kazan could do nothing without the permission of Moscow. War with Lithuania and Livonia. Liberation from the Tartar yoke allowed Ivan III to begin a gradual return of the Russian lands captured by Lithuania. From the Lithuanian feudal lords suffered oppression Russian princes who were under the rule of Lithuania. Many of them with their principalities went over to Moscow. In 1500, because of this, an open war broke out with Lithuania, which lasted 3 years. Moscow troops won several brilliant victories over the Lithuanians. The Livonian order entered into an alliance with Lithuania. German knights several times approached Pskov, but suffered a severe defeat from the Russian troops. According to the peace treaty with Lithuania, an ancient Russian region was annexed to the Moscow possessions, the Seversk land with the city of Chernigov. The Livonian order undertook to pay an annual tribute to the Moscow Grand Duke, but did not fulfill this obligation. 36. Social and state system of the Russian state at the end of the XV century. Development of commodity-money relations. The unification of the Russian people into a single state was possible only if there were some at least weak market links between Russian lands. The economy of the Russian state at the end of the XV century. Basically it remained natural. But the development of commodity-money relations in this period occurred more intensively than before. Between the individual cities and regions more lively trade relations were established. In Moscow, a large shopping center was created. There were benches and drawing room yards, i.e. yards where guests stayed, or merchants. Food for sale was brought to Moscow from the surrounding regions. One foreigner who visited Moscow under Ivan III vividly describes the winter bargaining. On the ice of the Moscow River, merchants put their shops with different goods. Here daily bread, meat, pigs, firewood, hay and other necessary supplies are brought daily throughout the winter. At the end of November all the surrounding residents kill their cows and pigs and take them to the city for sale. Lovingly look at this huge amount of dead cattle, completely ripped off and standing on the ice on their hind legs. Thus, now not all products were produced in each individual farm, but were also purchased in the market. The development of commodity-money relations is also indicated by the fact that landowners in the late 15th and early 16th centuries were no longer satisfied with receiving from their peasants dues by products, but demanded from them also money pledge. Due to the development of trade, the importance of merchants in cities increased. Already from the end of the XIV century, in Moscow, a group of rich merchants of the Surajans, i.e., merchants with Suraj, or Sudak, in the Crimea and clothers are mentioned. In addition to trade, rich merchants engaged in usury. They were in debt to many of the specific princes, even the brothers of Ivan III. The merchant class was interested in stopping the feudal wars and uniting all the Russian lands, since this would facilitate trade relations between individual parts of the country. Landlords and peasants. The economy in feudal estates remained natural. It still had difficulty adapting to the market. There was little money in the country. Needing money, landowners lingered with wealthy merchants, but mainly at monasteries, which collected large sums of money by collecting donations and usurious operations. The land was given as a pledge, which in case of non-payment of debt passed into the possession of monasteries. Large estates were ruined and crushed. The main military force now consisted not of large landowners, who under new conditions could not maintain large military detachments at their own expense, but small landowners. Most of these small landowners were vassals of larger feudal lords and owned lands that they received from them for their service. The main mass of these, as they were called, service people were noblemen who belonged to the court of the Grand Duke. This name was extended to all small landowners who served in the Grand Duke's army. With a lack of money in the Grand Prince's treasury, the nobles did not receive a salary. Instead of paying a salary, The Grand Duke gave the nobleman a small piece of land, which he owned as long as he was serving military service. If a nobleman quit his service, he lost his land. The land plotted was given to a nobleman or other serviceman was called, unlike the patrimony that belonged to the owner on the right of full ownership, estate, and the servant who owned the estate was a landowner. Thus, the nobles formed an extensive layer of small landowners. Later all the landowners became landlords. The landlord had the right to collect the rent from the peasants who lived in his estates and force them to work at the corvée. Under feudal order, the peasant was never free. The feudalist forcibly kept him on his land, not hesitating to resort to even open violence. Especially difficult was to leave the land of the feudal lord. Old residents, i.e., peasants who had long lived in this patrimony. But the rest of the peasants were restricted in the freedom to move from one owner to another. The custom required that they leave only after the completion of all field work, at the beginning of winter, when the bread was already brought to the manor yard. After the emergence of a strong centralized state that defended the interests of feudal lords, the nobles wanted to legitimize this order and thus strengthen their power over the peasants even more. The peasants were severely constrained in the right transition from one owner to another. In Sudnik, published in 1497, the law was added, which further strengthened these constraints. By this law, Ivan III set out to provide landlords with serf labor. The peasant was allowed to leave the landowner only after the completion of all rural work. For the whole state, one term of the peasant exit was established the Yuryov Day, that is, on November 26, according to the old style. The peasant could leave the landlord within a week before St. George's Day and the week after St. George's Day. But previously he had to pay with the owner, to pay for the elderly, i.e. for the yard, which he used. The Moscow state was a feudal state. Therefore, it helped the landowners in every way to enslave the peasants. Numerous nobility has acquired great political significance in the state. Without their own lands, the nobles were entirely dependent on the Grand Duke, from whom they received estates and who gave them the opportunity to exploit the peasants. Therefore, the Grand Duke had loyal servants in the nobles. Relying on them, he could strengthen his power. Management in the army. After the scattered feudal principalities were united into a single feudal state, the administration in the Moscow Grand Duchy was organized on a new basis. Under Ivan III, all control was concentrated in the hands of the Grand Duke. All the former independent princes now moved to the service of the Grand Duke of Moscow and from independent sovereigns became the boyars of the Grand Duke. The most notable of them were included in the Duma of the Grand Duke, that is, the council, together with which he ruled. In the service, the former princes and the other boyars were not distributed according to their merits, but by birth or, as they were said, by breed. The most notable boyars received high posts. A noble boyar could not serve under the command of a less distinguished person or even in the same position with the less distinguished person. This order was called localism. Mestnichestvo brought a lot of damage to the state. Instead of able and intelligent people, it was necessary to appoint more nobles, even if they did not understand much. When appointments to the campaign or to a different service, disputes began because of the places, and this was detrimental to the affairs. Localism was a concession to the great feudal lords on the part of the Grand Duke. It greatly interfered with the proper course of affairs in the state. In the newly conquered areas, the Grand Duke appointed his deputies. The governors ruled over the regions entrusted to them, made a court, collected taxes. For this they, according to the old custom, fed at the expense of the population. In 1547, 17-year-old Ivan solemnly accepted the royal title. The title, Tsar, comes from the name of the Roman emperors, Caesar, and is equivalent to the word, emperor. This act emphasized the importance of the Russian state among other European states and the unlimited power of the Russian Tsar inside the country. Return to some of the old orders of the period of feudal fragmentation. which took place after the death of Elena Glinskaya, seriously affected the position of the broad masses of the population. This caused the uprising in Moscow in 1547 against the Glinskayas. The reason for this was a large fire that destroyed a significant part of the city. The inhabitants of Moscow were already brought to despair by the oppression of the Glinskaya and their people. Muscovites blamed the fire of their oppressors, shouting that Princess Anna Glinskaya, the king's grandmother, magically lit Moscow. One of the Glinskaya was killed, the other fled. The king himself took refuge in his village Vorobyov, on the present Lenin Hills. Requirements of the nobility. When the uprising was suppressed, the king formed a new government, which was to restore order. Not trusting the boyars, the Tsar placed at the head of the administration of a man not very noble, but clever, Alexei Adyshev. With the support of influential court priest Sylvester Adyshev composed a strong party, which included some of the major boyars, and with her assistance carried out a series of reforms. Of his supporters, he formed the elected Rada, that is, the Near Duma, without which the young king did not decide anything. The next task of the elected Happy was the creation of a strong government. To do this, it was necessary to satisfy the demands of the main mass of service people, small noblemen, landlords. The demands of the service people found themselves at this time an expression in the writings of the nobleman Ivan Parazvitov. In the opinion of Paralitov, the Tsar must primarily care for the army, that is, for the nobility. He must provide it with land and money. Since there was not enough land, it was necessary to begin to conquer the Podrinsk land, the Kazan Khanate. In order to secure the nobility, Parazvitov offered money for all state revenues in the royal treasury, and for this purpose to abolish the feeding. To streamline the proceedings, Parazvitov considered it necessary to compile a set of laws and establish brutal punishments for bribery. All these measures could be carried out only under the condition of strong power and the destruction of the last remnants of feudal disunity. And since lazy wealthy fighters will fight against this, the boyars, Parazvitov advised to suppress their resistance with the thunderstorm, that is, terror, because, he said, without such a thunderstorm of truth you cannot enter the realm. Such was the program of the nobility. Part of the boyars was conscious of the need to make concessions. This part rallied around Adyshev and helped him carry out a series of measures that were to strengthen the Tsar's power and at the same time meet the most pressing needs of the nobility. Reforms of the 1550s. First of all, the government was reorganized. This was prompted not only by the demands of the nobility, but, chiefly, by the strong growth of discontent in the country with the old rules of government, which found its expression in the Moscow uprising of 1547. The dominant classes were threatened with popular indignation. There is news that in 1549 a council was convened in Moscow, that is, a meeting of the clergy, boyars and nobles, at which measures to pacify the country were discussed. In 1550 a new code of law was published, which established the procedure for judicial proceedings and punishment for bribery. The Sudnik restricted the authority of the governors and strengthened the power of the Tsar. Even during the childhood of Ivan IV, the cases of capture of the robbers were removed from the conduct of the governors, who from such cases created an article of income for themselves, and were entrusted to a special labial elder, from the word lip to the district. The labial elders were chosen by the local population from the local nobility. In fact, the whole matter of elections was concentrated in the hands of the nobility. This gave the nobles great power over the peasants who lived in the county. In 1555, under pressure from the ground, feeding was completely abolished. The deputies were replaced by elected heads and judges. These heads and judges tried the townspeople and the black, i.e., the state peasants, and collected taxes from them. The peasants who lived on the lands of the feudal lords were subject to a court of landowners. Revenues began to flow directly to the treasury. This measure, which met all the wishes of Peresvetov, was a very important step towards centralizing government. At the same time, measures were taken to improve the service status of the nobility and to increase his fighting efficiency. In 1555 the Code of Military Service was published. The normal size of the estate, about 150 hectares, was established, from which the landlord was to appear, on horseback and in full armor. If the serviceman owned a large amount of land, he should, according to the size of his estate or ancestral lands, supply a certain number of slaves. In order to provide the nobility with labor, the Code of Law of 1550 confirmed the right for peasants to leave landowners only on Yuriev's day. All these measures were in the interests of small and medium feudal lords, nobles. At the same time, these measures contributed to the strengthening of Tsar's power. 38. The Wars of Tsar Ivan IV. The conquest of the Volga Khanates. By the beginning of the reign of Ivan IV, the entire northeast Russia was already united. With it, the maintenance of the borders of the Russian state begins, first of all, from the Tatar Khanates closely associated with Turkey. At that time, the Turkish feudal lords strove to subordinate the Russian people. In the reign of Basil III, the Kazan Tatars, with the support of the Crimean Khan, freed themselves from Moscow's dependence. Kazan Tatars incessantly raided the border Russian lands, devastated them and led away a large number of prisoners. Ivan IV began the complete conquest of the Kazan Khanate. In addition to the need to ensure the borders of his state, Ivan IV sought to seize the rich lands and serfs, which required the nobility. Kazan, in addition, was the key to the Volga route leading to the Caspian Sea, and to the ways beyond the Urals. In 1550, a big campaign was launched against Kazan, which ended in failure. In the spring of 1551, the city of Svyazk was built in the country of Mary, on the mountainside of the Volga, against the city of Kazan. The mountain Mari, who until then had paid yasak to the Kazan Khans, were forced to obey the Muscovite Tsar. The following year, the Moscow troops, relying on Svyazk, crossed the Volga and besieged Kazan. The Tatars had a desperate resistance, but the inequality of power was too obvious. The Russian army consisted of 150,000 people and was well supplied with artillery. With the assistance of its own and foreign engineers, Kazan was squeezed by a ring of trenches, mobile towers were moved to its walls, and undermining was under the walls. Tatar troops in the city were only 30,000 people. With the support of partisan detachments attacking Moscow troops from the rear, Kazan held out for a month and a half. Finally, the walls of the city were blown up. October 2, 1552 Kazan was taken by storm. However, the struggle did not stop even after the fall of Kazan. The local population, Tatars, Mari, Udmurt, Chuvash, Mordva, continued to resist the conquerors. The rebels inflicted a heavy defeat on the Moscow troops and even captured the messenger sent against them by the voivoda. Only after a 5-year struggle it was possible to attract local feudal lords to the side of the Russian Tsar by bribery. The lands of the former Kazan Khanate were handed out to Moscow servicemen and clergy. The population was converted into serfs. In operation of the peasant population of the Volga region, Tatar feudal lords also participated, who retained part of their lands and were equalized in position with the Moscow nobles. Thus, the working masses of the Volga region were under double oppression, Moscow and local feudal lords. With the conquest of Kazan, the Bashkirs also obeyed. In 1556, it was Astrakhan's turn. Moscow servicemen drove the local Khan out and occupied the city. Thus, the whole course of the Volga was in the hands of Moscow. Accession of Astrakhan opened the way to the Caspian countries. After the capture of Kazan recognized himself as a vassal of Moscow, the owner of the Siberian Khanate Yidigarin promised to pay the Moscow Tsar an annual tribute. Using internecine strife between the princes of the North Caucasus, Ivan IV ordered to build a city on the Terek River, but under the pressure of Turkey decided to leave it. The Russian Cossacks, that is, the militia, did not obey this decision and continued to live on the Terek. After the annexation of Kazan and Astrakhan, the Crimean Khanate remained unaffected. Every year the Crimean Tatars made devastating raids on the bordering Russian regions and took thousands of prisoners to thousands, who were sold to Turkey. To secure the southern borders of these raids, a fortified line was built, the so-called Tula Tseseknaya feature, consisting of a number of forest passes, fortresses and other artificial fortifications. To monitor the Tatars sent to the steppe troops, or, as they were called, villages, and arranged in the steppe guard posts. Usually the cadet watched from the tall tree, and beneath the tree stood his companions with stiffened horses. As soon as there was a column of dust in the distance, which indicated the approach of the Tatar cavalry, one of the soldiers began to gallop with this news to the next sentry post, from where they let us know further. So the news of the arrival of the Tatars very quickly reached Moscow and allowed the army to hasten to meet the Tatars. In the late 50s of the XVI century, the Moscow government passed to the offensive on the Crimea. Russian troops descended on ships along the Don and along the Dnieper and invaded the Crimean coast. The war that began in 1558 for the Baltic states prevented these successes from being used. The beginning of the war for Livonia. Life needs forced Moscow to seek an outlet to the Baltic Sea. Moscow needed access to the sea and for the development of trade and for establishing cultural ties with Western Europe. Cut off from it by Livonia and Lithuania, Moscow and its relations with Western Europe actually depended on these two states, which were interested in preserving the backwardness of the Russian state and obstinately prevented the arrival of Western European specialists and technicians in the service of the Russian Tsar. After the defeat at Grunwald, the German chivalry came into ever greater decline and could not preserve the independence of its possessions. Domination over Livonia meant domination over the Baltic Sea. Therefore, a clash over Livonia between neighboring countries, Lithuania, Sweden, Denmark and Russia, was on the way. In January 1558 Ivan IV opened military operations against Livonia. A few months later Narva was taken, one of the most important ports of Livonia. Then Derpt, the ancient Russian city of Yuriev, fell. German hailstones surrendered one by one to the Moscow voivoda. Under the blows of the Moscow troops, Livonia disintegrated. Alarmed by the successes of Russian weapons, neighboring states intervened in the affairs of Livonia. Revel gave himself up to Sweden, the island of Ezel to Denmark. The rest of Livonia succumbed to the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania Sigismund August. The master of the Livonian order retained only Courland as a vassal of the Polish king. Thus, the German order, which once threatened Russia, ceased to exist as a result of the defeat inflicted on him by Ivan IV. The partition of Livonia led to the delay of the war, and this circumstance heavily affected the internal state of the Russian state. 39. Oprichnina. Education. Oprichnina. Tsar Ivan was dissatisfied with the fact that the elected parliament did not conduct a vigorous war in Livonia. The discrepancy between Tsar Ivan and the elected Rada began soon after the capture of Kazan. Boyars, belonging to the Adashev party, sought to limit the power of the king. Adashev and the priest Sylvester consulted on all matters with their boyar supporters secretly from the Tsar. Thus, the autocracy was undermined, without which it was impossible to create a strong state and defeat the enemies. Therefore, an attempt to limit the power of the Tsar in the interests of a small group of boyars met strong resistance from broad circles of the service class. At the beginning of 1560 the Tsar removed Adashev from Moscow and appointed him a simple voivode to one of the conquered Livonian cities, where he soon died. At the same time he was removed to the Sylvester monastery. But their supporters continued to conduct subversive work. Some of them were executed, some fled to Lithuania to the enemies of the Russian state. In 1564, Prince Kurbsky, a prominent commander, whom the Tsar placed at the head of the army that operated in Livonia, changed and, according to a preliminary agreement with Sigismund Augustus, fled to Lithuania. In Lithuania, Kurbsky received a generous reward, large land holdings for treason, and was appointed commander of one of the armies operating against his homeland. Treason Kurbsky led to new executions. The boyar changes and the failures in Livonia raised the question of concentrating power in the hands of the Tsar, the complete liquidation of the boyar opposition, and the survivals of feudal disunity. These goals were pursued by the reorganization of state administration, carried out by Ivan IV in early 1565. Not trusting the boyars surrounding him, the Tsar suddenly left Moscow under the protection of a special squad of nobles. He stopped at the fortified Alexandrovskaya Sloboda and from there sent to Moscow a letter to the Metropolitan with the list of the boyars' admonitions and with reproaches to the clergy for adhering to the traitors. The king declared that he was giving up the throne. In a special letter to the Moscow merchants and to the people, the Tsar wrote that he had no anger on them. Under the pressure of Moscow citizens in the Alexander Sloboda from Moscow, the deputation of the clergy and boyars went to beg the king not to give up the throne. Ivan IV agreed, but demanded more authority to fight the boyars. The population of the capital, frightened by the possibility of seizing power by the boyars, welcomed the establishment of new orders in the state and terror against the boyars. The whole territory of the state was divided into two parts. The Zemstvo, in which the management remained in the hands of the Boyar Duma, acting under the leadership of the Tsar, and the Oprichnina, that is, the personal possession of the Tsar. The Oprichnina structure included the best regions located in the center of the state or having a great commercial significance. The city of Moscow was divided between Zemshkina and Oprichnina. At the same time there were Oprichny and Zemstvo boyars and voivods, orders that governed the Zemstvo and administered the Oprichnina. The capital of the Oprichnina was Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, where the Tsar felt more secure. Oprichnina was to finally break the power of the big feudal lords and create from the small landed gentry cadres, which could rely on a strong central authority. Large feudal lords, especially the descendants of specific princes, still have not lost political power. Lenin wrote, "The state disintegrated into separate lands. Even part of the principality, which preserved living traces of the former autonomy, peculiarities in government, sometimes its special troops, local boyars went to war with their regiments, special customs borders, etc. This situation was incompatible with the interests of the centralized feudal state. Therefore, all princes and boyars were removed from the territory of the Oprichnina. Their patrimonies were taken to the sovereign. In return, they were given other lands, far from equal, in remote areas where they had no political ties. Their former patrimonies were distributed to small nobles, from which a special corps of Oprichniki was formed. At the head of the Oprichnina was put Melchior Skuratov, who enjoyed great confidence in the Tsar. The main task of the Oprichniki was the eradication of the remnants of feudal disunity. Oprichnina, who accomplished this task, had a progressive significance in the history of our country. The Oprichniki were recruited from the small landed gentry, who in their own interests supported the Tsar in his struggle against the boyars. With the help of the Oprichniki, the Tsar conducted a most cruel terror against the boyars. Ivan IV mercilessly executed his enemies, exterminated the upper strata of the feudal lords, not only ruined them, generously, even to young children, but did not spare their servants and peasants. Attempts by large secular and spiritual vassals to unite in order to fight against the Tsar have ended in failure. Metropolitan Philip, who belonged to the noble family of the Kolichevs, tried to intercede for the boyars, but was deposed, exiled to a monastery and secretly murdered there. Around 1567 a large boyar plot was formed, but it was uncovered and its participants were executed. To the conspiracy Novgorod joined, in which the traditions of the former political independence were still alive. Part of the Novgorodians together with the archbishop was ready to change and surrender to Lithuania. In January 1570, the Tsar led a large punitive expedition against Novgorod. From Novgorod the king moved to Pskov. Oprichnina met the class interests of the petty and middle nobility. In anticipation of help, the Cossacks continued to conquer the surrounding lands. The inhabitants, armed with spears and arrows, sometimes not even with iron, but with bone tips, could not withstand firearms. Despite the rapid success, the position of a small detachment of Wehrmacht became difficult. Even the arrival of an auxiliary detachment of the Tsarist troops did not help. Due to a lack of food among the Russian service people, Single began. Ermak himself was killed in an ambush in which he was lured by Kachum. When trying to jump into the boat, Ermak stumbled and drowned in the Irtysh. The surviving Russian servicemen were forced to leave Siberia. The capital of the Khanate was again occupied by the Tatars. The annexation of western Siberia. Even after the death of Ivan IV, voivodes with a considerable army were sent to Siberia. They built the city of Tyumen in 1586 on the ruins of the Tatar city of the same name, and from here began the gradual conquest of the country. The following year, a small Tobolsk island was placed on the Tobol River near the former capital of Kachum, which was finally abandoned by the inhabitants. Tobolsk became the center of royal domination in western Siberia. In subsequent years, the neighboring Manasai and Khantai tribes were conquered. However, the struggle against Kachum was not over. He continued to roam the Barabansk steppe and disturb the border areas with his raids. Only in 1598 Kachum was defeated completely, from which he no longer recovered. The relatively quick victory over the Siberian Khanate is explained, in addition to the technical superiority of the Russian troops, the lack of political unity among the Tatars. The Siberian Khanate disintegrated into a number of small possessions that were poorly welded together. At the first failure of Kachum, the vassals abandoned him. Even weaker was the connection between the Siberian Khanate and the Ostyak and Vogel princes who were under his control, who only by force participated in the Khan's army and fled as soon as possible. The peoples, repressed by Tsarism, were encased in Yasak, who went to the Tsarist treasury. Yasak paid sable and other expensive furs. In addition to the king's Yasak, the Siberian peoples were supposed to give gifts to voivodes and servicemen. To compel to pay the Yazaka, the amenities or hostages were taken. The government resorted to bribing the local princes, bestowing on them with all sorts of trinkets for regular contribution of the Yasak and treating them with state money, wine, etc. The furs that came from Siberia were of great value. The treasury sold them abroad. The sale of furs was one of the profitable articles to cover the military and other expenses of the state. Together with the Tsarist troops, Moscow merchants penetrated Siberia. They carried cheap goods with them, bells, cloth flaps, etc. In exchange for them, they took from the Siberian people's precious furs. The merchants shamelessly soldered the inhabitants of the taiga to extort sable and other skins from them for a song. Thus, in the XVI century, under the rule of the Moscow Tsars, there were a number of other peoples besides Russians: Kazan and Astrakhan Tatars, Mordvins, Mari, Chuvash, Udmurts, Bashkirs and peoples of western Siberia. In this way a multinational state was formed in Russia. Around the strong Russian government, other weaker peoples were united. See map on page 227. 42. Trade and craft in the Russian state in the 16th century. The unification of Eastern Europe into a centralized multinational state was possible only if there were economic ties between the lands that were part of the state. In the XVI century, there is a development of commodity-money relations, which prepared the economic unification of the country and facilitated the process of its political unification. Various crafts developed. In cities, the number of people engaged in craft and trade and growing up from agriculture increased. Cities needed food. They also needed raw handicrafts. Therefore, bread was brought from the fertile regions to large urban centers, from the lands located near the Arctic Ocean, fish and salt, from areas where ore was mined, iron, from Siberia, expensive sables and other furs. Trade relations between separate parts of the state were strengthened. The center of this commercial and industrial revival was Moscow, where near the Red Square rows with numerous shops of merchants and craftsmen were built and a special courtyard for the arrival of foreign merchants was built. In the XVI century, trade relations of the Russian state with the East and with the West have developed significantly. With the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan in the hands of Moscow was the whole waterway to the Caspian Sea. This helped to strengthen trade with Azerbaijan, Persia and Bukhara. Russia's relations with Western Europe were hampered by the fact that between them lay hostile countries, Poland, Lithuania and the possessions of the Livonian Order. From 1553, trade relations between the Russian state and England began through the White Sea. The 16th century was the century of the heyday of English trade. The English merchantry entered into a fierce struggle with the Spaniards and the Portuguese, who until then dominated the sea. The sea route to India, around Africa, was in the hands of the Portuguese. The British merchants classed an expedition to find the road to India through the Arctic Ocean, that is, the Great Northern Sea route, which became available to ships only under Soviet power. The expedition failed, but one ship under the command of Captain Chancellor Storm was brought to the White Sea, to the mouth of the northern Dwina. Chancellor entered into relations with the voivode of the nearest town of Kolmogorye, who notified Ivan IV about the arrival of the English captain. Chancellor was summoned to the capital. Ivan IV understood all the benefits of direct communication with one of the richest trading countries in Europe. The way to Western Europe around the Scandinavian peninsula was known to the Russians, who used it for trade and diplomatic relations. Ivan IV granted the British the right to trade in the Russian state on the most preferential terms. In the Russian state, its own industry was poorly developed. From England, Russia received cloth and other fabrics, metals and metal products, as well as spices and other goods originating from Asia, Africa and America. In exchange, the English merchants took Russian raw materials, furs, hemp, lard, etc., and also bought Eastern goods, especially Azerbaijani silk. Following the British, the Dutch began to use the northern route to trade with Moscow. Soon after the death of Ivan IV, near the mouth of the northern Dwina, the city of Arkhangelsk was built. Every year a fair took place there, at which foreign merchants met with Russian merchants. But the White Sea is covered with ice for much of the year. Relations could be conducted on the sea only in the summer months. Therefore Russia persistently aspired to seize the coast of the Baltic Sea. Enhanced trade relations with Western Europe and the East contributed to the revival in the domestic Russian market. For the precious furs, the industrialists sought eastward, beyond the Urals. Sea expeditions were equipped in the Ob in search of sable, celibate places. In towns and villages in the XVI century, small handicraft production was spread. In large cities, like Novgorod and Kazan, in the XVI century, there were more than 100 kinds of handicraft production. There were masters who specialized in the manufacture of earrings, pins, nails, sewing sarafans, snuffles, calfskin, etc. Merchants bought handicrafts, drove them to Siberia and exchanged for furs, which were then resold to foreigners. This established the links between individual markets, preparing to merge them into one all-Russian market.